Alright, it's finally time to tackle what is currently the most requested ancient DOS game for me to cover. That game being the original Prince of Persia. Now, I've already covered the sequel, Prince of Persia 2, not that many episodes ago, and I found that game to be overly frustrating, but I at least understood why people enjoyed it, and also commented that it'd be interesting to compare it to the original to see which is better, which is worse, what's the same, what's different, etc. Well, now that I've played through as much of this first game as I can stomach, they are surprisingly similar. In fact, maybe a little too similar. So what I mean is that when I was playing through the second game in the series, one of the things I read is that the game's original designer and programmer, Jordan Mechner, wasn't technically involved with the sequel. Not that he didn't have anything to do with it, far from it. But what happened was that he had written a 200-page design document known as the Prince of Persia 2 Bible, handed it to the dev team and simply said, "Make this," and was then completely hands-off from that point forward. And I think it kind of shows in the final product when you reference it back to the original game, as the controls, raw gameplay, and even the motion of the rotoscoped animations all transferred over from the first game to the second one. In fact, this kind of revealed an interesting thing in that most of the main problems I had with the second game were all the mechanics which were added or changed from the original game. For instance, the little shooting traps at the ground in the second game, they're not here in the first one, and they were definitely one of the more annoying things to have to deal with in the second game. Or another important point is that here in the first game, you can tell visually which floor panels will open doors and which floor panels will close doors, whereas in the second game, there was no visual distinction. So, does this all mean the first game is better than the second one? Not even close. But it's not worse than the second one either. Both games are about on par with each other, for different reasons, and it should become pretty clear what makes the games fundamentally equivalent as we go through everything going on with this first one. As stated, Prince of Persia was originally conceived by Jordan Mechner, who was working at Brøderbund and was thus subsequently published by Brøderbund in 1989, originally for Apple II computers, with the DOS port following in 1990, and then countless other ports following that, most of which were not developed or published by Brøderbund. Now, it's a one-player cinematic platformer, often considered the first of its kind, with support for a variety of video modes, from monochrome Hercules all the way up to 256-color MCGA graphics, and supports a wide variety of audio devices. However, the main reason it's taken so long to get around to this game is because, as far as its current release date is concerned, it was never officially made freeware. Thus, there's no direct, legitimate downloads of the DOS version, and on top of that, it is extremely hard to source physical copies of this game for nearly every reason there is. The game is very rare despite the huge number of copies sold. It's very expensive, typically going for nearly $50 just for a loose disc, with fully boxed copies going well into the triple-digit range. But the worst part is that it blends in too easily with the 2008 reboot of the series, which has the exact same name, which you're going to find, no joke, 100 copies of for every one copy of the original game. All that said, there's some important things to remember if you want to play the original Prince of Persia and don't want to resort to abandonware, although that's certainly an option for anyone who's okay with going that route. Firstly, because this game got ported to practically everything, and because it wasn't originally an arcade title, most of the ports are very faithful to the original game. Thus, any of the ports will do if you just want to play the game in any format, some of which are much easier to come across than the DOS version. Now, if you insist on playing a legit DOS copy, though, keep your eyes peeled for the Limited Edition Collection CD, which has the first two Prince of Persia games on it, and typically goes for $50 as a sealed jewel case, though loose copies don't tend to sell for much less, typically $30 to $40. One last thing to quickly point out, too, is that the original Apple II source code is available online, though naturally the source code alone isn't enough to play the game, and is more a point of curiosity for those who want to see how the game was coded. Just like with the second game, there's surprisingly little to say about the story for the first game, so I'm not going to dedicate a whole story section to it, but it at least has some good drama for as short as it is. Basically, you play the role of a young adventurer who's won the heart of the Sultan's daughter and are destined to be married. But, with the Sultan off fighting a war in a distant country, the Grand Vizier Jafar decides to act on his ambitions and takes total control of the land, imprisoning the young adventurer and demanding the princess marry him instead, which would secure his right to the throne. But when the princess turns him down, he decides to cast a spell upon her, giving her but 1 hour to change her mind or die. The princess will not relent, even unto death, thus everything now rests on the shoulders of the imprisoned adventurer, who must make his way out of the dungeons and defeat the evil Jafar before his magic can take hold. It becomes apparent very quickly when you start playing that this is not your typical platformer. You have controls to move left and right, a button to jump, a button to crouch, and an action button, used either to grab ledges, walk instead of run, or swing your sword in combat. However, everything is animated very fluidly and deliberately. Thus, each action you take needs to be planned well in order to succeed, especially given that fall damage is a thing. In fact, the map structure is explicitly designed to separate things out into multiple stories, as it were, whereby you can survive a 1-story fall without issue, a 2-story fall will hurt, but you will survive, and a 3-story fall or greater is instantly fatal. And in all cases, if you're able to climb down the edge of a ledge first, you can give yourself an extra story of survivability. Now, one thing I noticed which explains a few things is that the controls here are identical to the sequel, except that the shift keys actually work here, whereas I was having trouble getting the shift keys to work in the sequel, but I figured out what was up with this. The shift keys only work properly when used alongside the arrow keys. If you use the numeric keypad, like the manual suggests, the shift keys stop working reliably, at least in terms of DOSBox emulation. I imagine this isn't likely an issue on real hardware, but then I have no good way to test that at the moment. Another thing that becomes apparent very quickly, having played the sequel first, is that this original game is much simpler and much better defined in terms of game mechanics. For instance, you can see the separations between the different floor tiles, which is incredibly helpful in terms of jumping, especially given how the automatic jumping mechanics work. See, both games claim that the jumping is done in a special way so that when you press the jump button while running, your character will wait until the last possible moment to perform the jump. The second game didn't actually do this. You had to time some running jumps incredibly precisely as a result of that. But does this feature work in this game as intended? Well, sort of. It's more accurate to say the game times out your jumps based on which tile you're on when you press the button. Essentially, whenever you're running and you press the jump button, the game checks to see which tile you're on and will then time it so that you perform your jump at the very edge of the next tile. Thus, anytime you perform a running jump, you want to time it so that you press jump while over the tile that's 1 tile away from the edge you want to leap across. This doesn't have to be super precise, so it's best to try and time it so that you're in the middle of the tile when you press the button. Otherwise, it becomes more likely to accidentally miss this timing and end up jumping too early or too late. The combat is also much simpler to deal with here than in the sequel, as the AI isn't quite so smart or random about it. Now, there's very specific timing as to when the AI will attempt to make a move, and once you have that timing down, you can frequently act just a tiny fraction of a second after the AI begins to act, ensuring that so long as the AI isn't taking a swing at you, you can get a swing in yourself. Thus, the best tactic for combat is to always stay just slightly out of range of the enemy's attacks, and take your swing the instant the enemy starts moving to close in. Then check your range again. You can tell if the enemy is too close because at least 1 pixel or more of your swords will be over top of one another vertically. If this happens, back off to give yourself some more room to work with, or if you've got some space between you and the enemy, make 1 step forward and immediately follow up with a sword swing. However, there is one enemy at the start of level 8 which is notoriously difficult, as said enemy does this exact same tactic to you. This is actually one of the more intense fights, as you need split-second reactions to survive it without taking a hit. The idea is to get close, but not close enough to trigger an attack, then make a step forward, immediately followed by a parry, immediately followed by a sword strike, then immediately followed by a parry if you were too close before you even started the attack. It's tricky to do, and you won't always hit, but you will always push the enemy back if they don't get a strike in on you. which can easily happen if your timing is off, since you can cancel your first parry if you try to strike too quickly following. One way or another, this tactic will defeat the enemy, or push him back so far he falls off the cliff and to his doom below. In fact, that is one thing I do like about the game, is that the enemies are not immune to the same traps you yourself are faced with. For instance, this skeleton here in level 3 is invulnerable, but is also kinda in the way. Once you get it knocked off the first cliff, what you can do is get yourself down on the right side of the skeleton and back up towards another ledge way to the right, which leads down to another ledge with a pit to the left. The skeleton will indeed chase you here, and you can then fight it long enough to push it back over the left edge into a place it cannot recover from. I'm about 99% certain this was not the intended method for dealing with the skeleton, but I appreciate the fact that this trick does work. Before I could even get further than level 1 though, I had to pass the manual-based copy protection. Now, I was only sent a disc, not a manual, as shown here, so I had to look up the manual online. Now, I wasn't 100% certain what the game meant by line here, like if it meant actual physical line in the manual or full sentence or what, but either way, the answer was going to be Y or W. So I tried the Y potion first. Nope, that means it must be the W potion. Wait, what? It had to be the Y or the W. What the heck is going on here? This stopped me cold for a bit because I wasn't just reading a transcript, it was a fully scanned manual included with the original DOS version of the game. Everywhere I went online with replacement manuals is referencing this same manual. But it turns out I missed something very pertinent. My installer for the game identified itself as version 1.3. But there's no patches for this game, as far as I'm aware, meaning that my copy might have been from a later re-release which may have a different manual and thus different copy protection answers. Sure enough, with enough searching, I found a copy of the later manual, and yeah, it is definitely different. Or more precisely, it has a lot of the same stuff as the original manual, but includes a few additional things, and is also formatted differently, and thus the actual lines have different words on them. And once I had the right manual in hand, getting past the copy protection was a piece of cake. Another important thing to note is that the game only has one save slot, and you can only start saving your game once you reach level 3, with there being 12 levels in total. A couple of which are very short, and some of which are a bit longer, none of which are as big as the levels in the sequel. If you know exactly what you're doing, these levels can go by surprisingly fast. But therein lies the rub. You have to know exactly what you're doing, or you're never beating this game. This actually ties in with a question from one of my Patreon supporters, Martin, who asks, does the first entry allow similar cheesing like the second, i.e. that it's possible to save after each level and play it once slow, then do a speedrun to keep enough time on the precious 60 minutes timer? See, here's the thing. Not only is it very possible to play the game in this manner, it's pretty much required. In fact, let's put it in perspective. You get 1 hour, 60 minutes, to beat the game, and have 12 levels to survive in order to accomplish this, with there only being a couple small levels that you could do in about a minute. So if we divide 58 by the remaining 10 levels, we only get just shy of 6 minutes to complete every level. Now this is possible, but with almost no margin for error. If you make any mistake which costs you more than 15 or 20 seconds, just forget it and reload. But knowing full well that the time limit was going to be insanely tight, I intentionally played the game in this manner, practicing a level first, then going through it as fast as I could once I knew what I was doing, and still ran out of time as I only had 3 minutes left on the clock when I reached level 10. And guess what happens when the timer expires? You get a cutscene of the princess's bedchamber with a finished hourglass and no more princess. I don't actually have much more to go into here, but I will say that I feel the level design is a lot less cryptic here in the original game compared to the sequel. Now, I only used the walkthrough twice, and that was only to save myself some recording time, as I knew I could figure these problems out if I wanted to actually burn time on them. There's a couple moments that came up where it didn't make sense immediately what I was supposed to do, and I didn't want to spend an hour trying to solve them. Specifically, here in level 4, I got faced with a mirror of some sort blocking my path. I tried running into it, walking into it, crouching, jumping, but it turned out the way to get through it was to do a running jump, and it had to be timed perfectly. The most annoying place I got stuck, though, was here in level 8, right near the end, where you end up completely trapped with no apparent way to get out. The solution is to literally just wait on this screen, as after a number of seconds, the princess's pet mouse shows up and steps on the floor panel, opening up the gate. Overall, I finally understand why I don't like the Prince of Persia games. They're early examples of elitist games, i.e. games intentionally designed so that you can only win if you play 100% perfectly. Otherwise, you're doomed to fail. The irony being that the only reason why these first two titles are elitist at all is because of that timer. Well, sure, speedrunners can beat this game in 15 to 30 minutes of in-game time, but just think about that for a second. There are speedrunners out there, people intentionally trying to play games as fast as possible, who still take half of the game's allotted time to win. Yeah, you can't play the Prince of Persia games casually, and that is ultimately the main problem I have with them. But, as I stated before, that's a subjective opinion. Speaking as a game designer, elitist games are not inherently bad, but it takes a certain kind of person to want to play through them, and thus having features present which make a game elitist immediately limits the game's reach and appeal. In fact, let's contrast this with another game people love to speedrun, Super Metroid. Heck, Super Metroid is probably the most speedrun game of all time, and the people who are good at that game are really freaking good at that game. But it has a wider reach and a wider audience because there's no time limit. Well, I mean, there's technically a time limit if you want to see Samus take her suit off, but even that time limit is generous enough that it can be done with a casual run so long as you generally know where to go and what to do. To that end, I feel the original Prince of Persia would have sold even better and reached a much wider audience and even higher levels of praise if two changes were made to it. The first, that time limit needs to be balanced better for casual play, but not removed. Now you might think after everything I said that I would want to see the time limit just gone entirely, and me personally, I wouldn't mind that. But I just said that it takes a certain kind of person to want to play through a game like this with a strict time limit at all. So making the time limit more generous without removing it entirely would have been a better idea. Now, I only had 3 minutes left when I reached level 10, despite my intentional efforts to practice levels before actually attempting them. So by that logic, I would say that the time limit should have been either 90 minutes or 120 minutes. But the second thing that should have been done along with that, which would make the game absolutely better in every single way, hide the time limit and don't cut the player off once it's exceeded. Instead, give the player a different ending based on if they complete the game fast enough and reveal their time following. That's what Super Metroid did, technically, even though its ending differences are very subtle. But the point is that cutting off the player is user hostile, and is something that belongs in the demo version of a game, not the full paid product. And again, these are things which are kind of seen in retrospect, because when you go back to the late 80s, there weren't a lot of precedents set yet as to how to handle this sort of stuff. So while I can effectively indicate what would have made the game better now, without losing the appeal to expert players, that kind of thinking and planning wasn't exactly common knowledge back then, and thus I can't really fault the game for not doing any of it. Just to say that this game, in the state it was released in, is definitely only for the most hardcore of game players out there, who are motivated by frustration. If that's not you, then this game is not worth your time because it's just gonna drive you insane. Although I do like it when I don't have to configure a thing in DOSBox. Just leave cycle set to auto and this game will run perfectly fine. Also, I do not recommend using a joystick or gamepad to play this game due to how incredibly precise you need to be with the controls. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. I've actually been making some very significant game design progress myself over the past week, so to give myself a chance to really hammer those details out while my brain's still in the zone, as it were, I'm going to be covering some simple standby games 2 weeks from now on Saturday, August 19th, and probably again in the episode following that one. So for the next episode, episode 316, I'm going to be taking a look at a trio of Breakout clones that I played back as a kid. which I want to talk about, but each of which are too simple to do individual videos on. So be sure to stay tuned to get a taste of some simple DOS breakout style gameplay. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.